All right, guys, let's talk about population ecology. So population ecology just has a few ideas, but really we're talking about a group of the same species in an area, because don't forget, a population is when you have multiples of the same species, and a species is classified as a group of organisms that can reproduce and have viable offspring. And so one thing when we talk about ecology, because don't forget, ecology is the study of organisms within their house or within their habitat, is we need to sometimes know the population density. And population density is the number of individuals in a defined area. And ecologists really like to know this type of information because if you're looking, if we need to know if something's endangered or if we're doing hunting, how many organisms we should allow hunters to have tags for, etc. Now, one thing to take into consideration when we talk about population density is how my populations are dispersed, or how they're situated within their habitat. Okay, so one of the dispersions of populations is clumped, and so if this is my habitat, then that means we find the organisms just in clumps within the area. So if you think of like a school of fish, right, you have the entire ocean, but then you just have clumps of these fish. Uniform means within the area, within your habitat, the organisms are fairly spaced apart. We actually see that a lot with trees. If you were to go out to a forest that's not really disturbed by humans, you'll see that the trees are actually pretty evenly spaced, because if they start to crowd one another, then they compete with sunlight. But if they space just far enough apart, then they can get the sunlight and they're not competing for nutrients and water so much. So they usually show uniform. And then random dispersion just means your organisms are randomly within your area. Like maybe say, like a tiger, right? Like tigers don't really roam in packs. Like you just find them within their area. They're random. Now, when we talk about populations, we also need to, once we've figured out like their dispersion and their density, we can look at population size. So population size actually has 4 factors to it. We have immigration with an E. Don't forget, immigration E means when you exit a population. And if you exit a population, then your population is going to go down, right? If you have immigration with an I, remember that means I move into a population. Well, if I move into a population, my population is going to go up. And then birth, that if we have a lot of birth, then their numbers will go up. If you have a lot of death within your population, their population's number is going to go down. And so population size is determined by those 4 factors. And we like to know the population size, but we have to look at that because of the dispersion patterns and then by figuring out the density. Now, population growth is based on the available resources, okay? There's 2 types of population growths we see. We see exponential growth, and exponential growth just means that my population numbers keep going up and up and up. And that's because they have unlimited resources. So they have unlimited food and shelter and mates. If there's nothing holding that population back, then that population size is going to keep going up. What we normally see within a population, though, is logistic growth. Logistic growth means I have limited resources. So I have limited food and limited shelter and limited mates. This is what their graph looks like, is that it'll start to go up, but then it'll plateau, it'll even out. When it starts to even out, this is called my carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the max number of individuals an environment can support, right? That's what it can support comfortably. Because if the population starts to go up, then those resources become too limited, and that's when they would exit or organisms would die. But this is carrying capacity is about where that max number is set. Now, we also have some factors that limit population growth. So we have limiting factors. A limiting factor is something that keeps my population size down. I have 2 different kinds of limiting factors. I have density dependent. Remember, dependent means I need it. So this is affected by the number of individuals within a population. It's dependent It depends on the number. So predation would be a density dependent factor, because if I had within my habitat, if I had a ton of organisms, right, then predation is going to be dependent on it, right? But if I have very, very few organisms within that area, then predation is not so much a factor, right? So that's just a dependent factor. Or competition, the more organisms I have, the more competition I have. But, well, I mean, that's just what it is. If you have this habitat, right, and you only have this one watering hole and you have a ton of organisms, then competition goes higher, and that's a dependent factor. That's what your population growth is dependent upon how many organisms there are. Because if I get rid of some of those organisms, then there is less competition, and that's also going to affect the growth. Or disease. Disease is a density dependent factor, because if I have a habitat and like this guy and this guy and this guy are here and only one of them is sick, likely that the other ones will not get sick because they're not around them. But if I have a high population, then if this guy over here is sick, he's more likely to get everybody else sick because they're in close proximity. So that's a dependent thing. Versus a density independent factor means it's not affected by the number of individuals, my population growth. And so weather or a natural disaster, right? If I have an area and a tornado goes through, it doesn't matter if I had 4 organisms. It doesn't matter if I had 20 organisms. That tornado is going to go through that path regardless of how many organisms there are. That's a natural disaster. It's a flood as well. Say a flood doesn't care if there's 2 bunnies or 100 bunnies in an area. It's going to affect that area regardless. Or human activities, right? If this is my habitat and I want to build a building here, it doesn't matter if there were 1 tree or if there are 100 trees. Humans are still going to cut those suckers down. And so that's an independent factor. It was not affected by the number of individuals. This is density dependent factors are affected by the number of individuals. And my 2 types of growth. Logistic means I reach the carrying capacity, which is the max number. Exponential growth means I have unlimited resources. Population size can be affected by 4 things: the immigration, birth, and death. Population can be dispersed in a couple of different ways: clumped, uniform, and random. And then I can look at the population density, and population density is affected by everything underneath this. Okay, I hope that helps.